Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news, and wow do we have a story to talk about today. The Formula 1 technical regulations were updated yesterday for 2024, including a fair few new elements, chief among which the outlawing of what they describe as asymmetric braking devices. This heavily implies someone has been messing around in the grey areas. Either it's been found about now and some team is about to face a major decline, or has that decline as a result of this potentially already happens, which may explain some of the phenomena of this season so far. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. I'll do my best today to explain everything that's going on here in as much detail as possible. This is Jonathan Wheatley. He's leaving Red Bull for Audi. There's been some further reaction here, just kind of confirming that it's not happening yet. Basically, they say he'll be joining 2025 at the latest. So he's going to work for Red Bull until the end of the year, as kind of is Newey, although Newey's not really involved in the F1 stuff anymore as he was a few months ago before he departed. So Wheatley would join Audi sometime next year, basically, whether at the start or somewhat into the year. Quick update on Sauber. They still have to choose a driver, right? They didn't get Sainz as they wanted. They, of course, have Hülkenberg for next season. That'll become Audi in due course. You'd think Bottas, you probably keep him at this point, but apparently there's rumours that Mattia Binotto is even looking at Gabriel Bortoleto as a potential option, a driver that, wouldn't have been at the top of my list, but is nonetheless a driver they're thinking about. If they do this, it does feel very bad for Théo Pourchaire, because Pourchaire was a Sauber man, and he won Formula 2 last year, and yet it does not look like he's getting a chance in Formula 1 at all, probably forever, at least as it currently stands. McLaren, real quick, as we'll discuss this drama over the coming minutes, they have big upgrades in the works. They expect to gain more time on Red Bull, and let's be real, they already have a faster car than Red Bull on the evidence of the last few rounds. So Mercedes are bringing upgrades, McLaren are bringing upgrades, Red Bull have upgrades as well, but their last two upgrade packages, Red Bull, haven't really worked that well. Max especially was not happy with what they brought to Hungary, so look, we'll see. McLaren are the favourites right now for the Constructors' Championship. If their car gets even better, they are the heavy favourites for the Constructors' Championship. It's going to take a lot for Lando to chase down Max, but who knows? If their car becomes an absolute rocket ship, it's not absolutely out of the realms of possibility. And even if you've got Christian Horner, who has to effectively defends the way the team is currently trending Red Bull and says, well, look, yes, Newey's left, yes, Wheatley's left, and yes, Checo's in a horrible streak of form, our car's fallen off, Max hasn't won in 4 rounds, but he's like, look, we've still got talent in the team, right? It's still okay, we've got issues, but we've got to have solutions, we've got a tremendous pool of talent, but, he mainly talks about the drivers, which is fair. I mean, they've got Lawson, they've got Hadjo, who's probably going to win Formula 2, they've got Lindblad, as well as a very promising driver in Formula 3 that they are most certainly looking at, but are they losing in certain ways off the track that's affecting them more than maybe Horner would like to admit? But let's talk about the way that Red Bull have gone this season, right, and exactly whether there is a new explanation for why this might be the case. Because Max Verstappen, over the last few rounds since Silverstone, has led a grand total of 5 laps. As F1 guy Dan says, if you'd have told me this in Bahrain, based on the race pace data there that we'll look at over the coming minutes, that Max would have led 5 laps over all these Grand Prix since Silverstone, I'd have said you were absolutely bonkers. But no, over those last few rounds, we've had Piastri, Norris, Russell, Hamilton, Sainz and Leclerc all leading more laps than Max Verstappen has over the last few rounds. This, of course, the driver who scored pole position in the first 7 rounds of the season. So what's changed since then? Is it merely the other teams have got better, or have Red Bull got worse on some level? I think there's no doubt that Red Bull's car now doesn't seem as potent as it was at the start of the season. Frankly, Verstappen and Checo, they're complaining about problems with the car more now than they were before. So it seems to me it cannot just be that McLaren and Mercedes and Ferrari overnight took a massive step forward. Red Bull took a step back to some extent. McLaren took a big step forward, as have certainly Mercedes. So is there more to it than initially meets the eye? Well, intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below, because as Molly Marissa points out, the 2024 F1 sporting and technical regulations were updated yesterday with some very interesting changes. So a few things in here, things about the mule cars, things kind of correcting for time penalties, casualties and some of the drama that caused Aston Martin to protest the results of qualifying in China when Sainz kind of stopped off the track and then got going again. They've kind of clarified a few of those things. The interesting thing for our sake really today though is this. This is under Article 11, the brake system, brake circuit and pressure distribution. So here's the writing in black, and this in purple, pink, whatever you want to say, is the new clause or sentence that's been added to the regulations. Now, there wasn't like a big song and dance about this. It was kind of done without really anyone noticing apart from those that were paying good attention. And this is what it says. The brake system must be designed so that within each circuit, the forces applied to the brake pad are the same magnitude and act as opposing pairs on a given brake disc. This is the new part. Any system or mechanism which can produce systematically or intentionally asymmetric braking torques for a given axle is forbidden. So, what do we think about this? The idea is that when you press the brake pedal, the amount of force applied to both brakes, either, let's say, both rear tyres or both front, wheels, shall we say, the force that's applied to both of those wheels from that same axle has to be the same on the left and the right. It can be different between the front axle and the rear axle, which of course is the brake bias that the drivers are playing around with, but from the left side to the right side, it must be the same. That is what the first part implies, but maybe if you read this in a certain way, because they talk about the same magnitude and they act as opposing pairs, I don't know, maybe there's a way that you can interpret this as not meaning what it is designed to mean. And therefore, this new element has been added to say, look, if you guys are trying to interpret this in a grey area, any mechanism which can produce asymmetric braking left or right is forbidden. So they've made it very, very clear here. Now, have they just decided? Have they just woken up one day and thought, you know what? I think we should add another clause there just to clarify. Or is it far, far more likely that someone has either gone to the FIA and said, hey, we think somebody is doing this, and therefore they want to decide to clarify it. Maybe nobody is doing this, and they've merely added this because somebody said, hey, you reckon people could abuse this, Article 11.1.2, and the FIA guys say, yeah, maybe you're right, let's add another clause in. It is more likely, though, let's be real, that somebody has either been doing this or has been trying to do it, and is therefore liable to either, over the coming rounds, have a big fall off if somebody has been caught out, or it's already happened, and this is just getting added into the official regulations now. So let me take you back a couple of decades to 1997, 1998, where McLaren, and this is an article on McLaren's website, talking about the extra pedal. So the drivers back then, this was actually legal before they had outlawed it. Later, after they discovered they were doing it, there was a secret pedal in the car, and they kind of referred to it eventually as the fiddle brake. And there's been all sorts of cool stuff like this in F1 history. But effectively, this would allow the drivers to brake more with one rear tyre than the other. This simple concept allowed the rear brakes to operate on either the left or the right side only, providing a clear benefit under acceleration in corners and an instant lap time advantage that was worth roughly half a second a lap. That was kind of what was described, that this clever bit of kit, which was legal at the time before getting outlawed, was very impressive for McLaren to come up with this idea, a pretty simple idea in the first place, but it was giving them half a second per lap advantage by asymmetrically braking on the rear axle. So fast forward to today, and a few weeks ago we talked about this now. This was actually talked about during the Hungarian Grand Prix. Now you can debate on whether Antonio Lobato has any idea what he's talking about, but he said on the broadcast that he'd spoken to people in the paddock and a couple of teams had told him that they believe Red Bull's recent performance drop was because the team discovered something illegal on their car, so to speak. And there's been rumours that have been going around, and you might also wonder why no big journalist has picked this up. Why aren't Formula Uno, why aren't AMUS talking about this if it's actually true and if it's such a big deal? Maybe that's why, if it is true. I don't know if it's true. But if you're a journalist on this level, making such a claim is quite a big deal. So you got to be sure that it's true. Because I'm sure the journalists have heard about this and have heard the paddock rumours as well. Whether they can put the pieces together to come up with a piece that says, hey, this actually happens, that is another question entirely. But the rumours are out there, and there's a feeling that either Red Bull had to change something on their suspension or something anyway that has cost them some degree of performance, because it is remarkable, right, that, I mean, Max Verstappen from last year's Abu Dhabi to, of course, this year in Imola scored 8 pole positions on the bounce. And yet, since around about that time, the performance of the Red Bull has dramatically reduced. The other thing that I wanted to mention before we look at some of the race pace data to maybe back up the idea that their car isn't what it was, is how about what happened back in Australia, right? When Max's rear brake caught on fire right at the start of the race. Like, it was locked on more than it should have been. And I don't know if this is related, but I thought that it was kind of interesting because we haven't really seen this from anyone, and it hasn't happened since the Red Bull, and it hasn't happened for anybody else. The big talk at the time was actually whether it was a fault with the brake manufacturer, but the brake manufacturer came out and said, no, nothing on our fault, it was on the Red Bull end, the way they were implementing our brake mechanisms. So is there anything in that? Because the theory goes, if Red Bull were using, or maybe McLaren are using it today, and they're going to turn up to the next race and they're going to be terrible. I don't know. But, I mean, McLaren came up with this idea before. Would they try it again, like, given that they got banned before? I don't know. But let's say, hypothetically, Red Bull have been using some sort of trick to asymmetrically brake, which has been hidden within their car this year, maybe last year, like, who knows, right? And it was, I mean, back in the day, it was giving teams half a second of an advantage to McLaren back in the late 90s. Which, let's be real, that's basically been Red Bull's race pace advantage for the last couple of years. But if they had some sort of mechanism there in place to allow this to happen, you know, could it have contributed to what happened in Australia? Because it's a pretty rare thing to happen, this. And, I don't know, I thought it was interesting to mention at the very least. Also, this was worthy of note. Middle of July, you guys might remember, Red Bull suspected that McLaren were basically cheating with their brakes, and they said to the FIA, hey, can you check out this cooling duct on the brakes for, well, what they thought was a cooling duct for these sensor access points, but turned out that there wasn't really anything bad going on. So there might be nothing in that, but again, I always look at it as like, there can be a bit of prediction sometimes, right, where if Red Bull have been doing something dodgy with the brakes, all of a sudden they're like, hey, you know, governing body, look at McLaren, their brakes are dodgy or whatever, right? So at the time, I always thought there was something a little bit interesting about that. And, well, let's fast forward to today, because these were the race pace numbers back in Bahrain, and it just is very challenging for me to believe that this Red Bull car now is the same car that it was at the start of the season, because this was Bahrain, where Max was half a second quicker than the Ferraris, even faster than the McLarens, and basically a second a lap faster than the Mercedes at the time. Now, the Mercedes have made big progress, obviously, since then, as have McLaren, and Red Bull should have as well. I mean, you know, you're meant to bring upgrades to make the car faster. They have brought upgrades that they believed has worked on some level, but the car doesn't seem to be as fast. Like, I would be fascinated to see if we ran the Bahrain Grand Prix again tonight or whatever, right? Would the Red Bull be as fast as it was back at the start of the season? I don't know the answer to these questions, but I don't understand how we went from China, which this is the sprint race in China, right? When Max was, I mean, as I say, he was a second a lap faster. Like, thanks, Hamilton got P2 in the end because Alonso was holding up the field, so that's why Hamilton has to give thanks to Alonso for making that happen, because otherwise Perez would have come through and secured seconds here. But I mean, the race pace advantage at this point was borderline ridiculous, and it looked like Max was going to take every single pole position and was going to win every Grand Prix from now until the end of the season. But we turned up to Miami, and immediately it was kind of a different story, right? This is the Miami sprint race, where Max was obviously winning and he was the fastest driver, but he was only a tenth and a half ahead of the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc at the time, so that was interesting. And then the next day in the race, the McLaren won, right? Now, yes, Max had damage by going over the curbs and hit the bollard or whatever, but even that was like, was that not the time where Max started to talk about the curb riding wasn't so good? I know that it's not been a massive strength of the Red Bull for the last couple of years, but I don't know, it felt like something changed on the car at that point, or at least Max had more reason to talk about problems because the car wasn't, you know, so much faster. Of course, Norris goes on to win that Grand Prix in the end, and I mean, you know, the race pace was pretty even across the board. Obviously, as we fast forward further on, this was then Imola the weekend after, where Lando was the fastest man on track on average, and Max just about held on for the victory. And then, of course, if we go to the Belgian Grand Prix of last weekend, this is all on F1Pace.com, by the way, phenomenal website, we see Hamilton was the fastest man, then Piastri, then Verstappen, Leclerc was right there as well, covered a tenth off the pace. So, you know, is it plausible that McLaren, Mercedes, Ferrari, around about Miami, around about Imola, all caught up roughly half a second? Or is it more plausible that Red Bull also lost some time? So, I don't know what caused Red Bull to seemingly lose performance in their car, but this is a theoretical explanation as to what might have been going on. But of course, it might not even be true. Like, this is obviously pure speculation, right? But it's just, people have been talking about it as very interesting that we are having these conversations on asymmetric braking talks when they were not, these conversations not being had. All of a sudden, there's now a line in the regulations about it. So is that coincidence, or is there something happening? It may not be Red Bull, obviously. There could be another team that's been experimenting. There could be another team that is, trying to use it right now, and therefore they're going to turn up to the next race and be floundering because they no longer have this advantage. And who knows how much of an advantage it actually gives you? I don't know. But I'm frankly expecting at some point from now to the end of the season, some actual journalist to maybe have talked to some people and get more of an understanding of what may or may not have happened here, because there's got to be a story in there somewhere about how the RB20 went from securing 7 poles in a row and winning every Grand Prix by a mile to all of a sudden struggling to lead a Grand Prix as it has for the last few rounds. So yeah, massively intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Of course, like, Max still took pole by a mile in Spa, and that was very impressive. But I think a large part of that was downforce, was firstly Max, right? But also the downforce they're running in the wet conditions was a big deal as well. And Pierre Wache is also saying, like, look, the car is not as good as they thought it would be. We undoubtedly improved in some areas compared to last year, but not quite in some areas as expected. Of course, he's not going to say, oh, they got us, like that type of stuff. But if they did get someone, like, even, let's say, McLaren have been using this asymmetric braking over the last few rounds and now it's going to be gone, like, what does that count as, right? Because is it technically against the regulations? Is it in a grey area? Is it against the spirit of the regulations? Is it intentionally deceiving the rules to gain a competitive advantage? Like, there's another word for that. So, yeah, very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments, really, on what your explanation might be for this whole saga. And just one final interesting thing to close out with. Well, there's a first time for everything, isn't there? Because every single time in Formula 1 history that a driver has been disqualified from a race win, they've won the championship. James Hunt in 76, Nelson Piquet in 82, Alain Prost in 85, Ayrton Senna in 89, and Michael Schumacher in 94, the last time a driver was disqualified from the race victory. That happened in Spa 30 years ago, before George Russell got disqualified from the win this year. But, looking at the Drivers' Championship, it does not seem especially likely that Russell is going to make some insane progress and actually win this year's championship. So probably that streak is going to come to an end. But very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comment section below. 2 years ago today, by the way, this tweet came out. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.